maybe?
I think you'll be fine. Let's see how it goes. And then
Okay.
if there's one image I'd like to see, it's yours. But I'll
Yeah.
turn mine off.
No, that's no problem. If it's problematic, let me know. Thank you very much for that introduction. So, yeah, so as Marie explained, my research, which was kind of the basis of my thesis and an upcoming monograph, was looking at the barriers to marriage equality in sub-Saharan Africa, basically the barriers to same-sex marriage. But as part of that research, it needed an exploration, if you will, as to the history and where the origins, if you will, the origin story of the criminalization of same-sex relationships. Um, because in sub-Saharan Africa, the issues of same-sex relationships are often the subject of sort of social and political and religious controversy. Because on one hand, you have a situation where sexual minorities are seeking legal reform of the laws that criminalize same-sex acts or sexual nonconformity or restrict, advocacy or, certain behaviors. And then on the other hand, you have politicians and religious leaders, and I suppose the public that oppose the recognition of LGBT rights, LGBT plus rights, and they argue in particular that same-sex relationships are against African norms, against traditions, against religion, and that the recognition of such is essentially a colonial import and it's un-African, if you will, when really, in fact, many of these acts were present in pre-colonial Africa. So you now have a situation where a lot of African countries, they criminalize homosexuality, if you will. You may have seen recently in the news, particularly last year, for example, Uganda's Anti-Homosexuality Act 2023. And then you've got other pieces of legislation, such as Nigeria's Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act, and various other sort of legislation, if you will, that effectively criminalizes same sex acts in various countries across the continent. So, as a consequence of that, you kind of have these two narratives that dominate the discussions of same sex orientation. Like I said earlier, firstly, the one that homosexuality is against African norms and that it was introduced through colonialism, and that homosexuality was introduced through colonialism, if you will. So essentially, to recognize LGBT rights would be another form of Western cultural infiltration and imperialism. Whereas on the other hand, you have other narratives that basically, suggest that same-sex conduct existed in various societies. And you have historical and anthropological studies that assert that prior to colonialism, same-sex relationships and even, same-sex marriages to an extent took place with a variety of motives and practices involved. Um, Now, I suppose one thing to mention is that in relation to the first narrative, the continued existence and expansion of sort of anti-gay rhetoric relies on the essentialist notion of an authentic Africanness, which is kind of based on the belief that there is something intrinsic in Africa called African culture and African traditions, but Africa is not one country. It's made up of various cultures and made up of various traditions. So to assert that, homosexuality is against African norms kind of doesn't make sense because, these cultures and these traditions are not, what's the word I'm looking for? Monolithic. They're not rigid, if you will. So instead, this argument is actually used as a weapon of oppression and a weapon of rejection of equality claims by sexual minorities. But I guess in order to sort of understand how these current attitudes towards same sex relations were formed or informed, then we kind of have to look at sort of the history behind it. So that's sort of what I'm kind of going to do, if my technology works. Okie dokie. So like I said earlier, a second ago, sexuality in sub-Saharan Africa, it kind of has various manifestations with these attitudes that vary according to culture, according to tradition, even according to region. And kind of these variations, they include, sexual knowledge or beliefs or value systems, as well as procreation. And in most African cultures, there is a great emphasis was placed on sex as a means of reproduction and connecting the individual to the family and their ancestors, but also as a means to sort of good standing in the community. And this was kind of seen as essential to good health. So, where males or females deviated from the norm and engaged in same sex activity, it didn't necessarily invoke scandal or shame or explicit denial, as you often find now, um, because sort of customary ways of explaining and dealing with this varied widely. But it often just showed kind of like a sophisticated appreciation of human diversity. So these activities were considered sort of to carry some symbolism and were treated maybe to some extent as a product of the spiritual realm. Some scholars have argued that the desire to sort of preserve community harmony and people's sense of dignity was strongly evident in African responses to same sex behavior. So there's kind of like a de facto tolerance. And it's this de facto tolerance of, I guess, individual nonconformity. It was possible because I suppose if the act itself, if the sexual activity itself didn't result in conception, um, then they weren't necessarily considered as problematic, as long as, well, if they were kept discreet. They didn't affect the family, they didn't affect the community. We think about, I guess, in the context of marriages, marriages were not simply arrangements between individuals, but rather between lineages. So, community elders regulated sexual behavior and the selection of spouses. But a key factor to the fundamental transformation of, I guess, African marriage and sexual relationships during the colonial period was very much the intrusion of colonial European moral discourse that kind of altered the meaning of African sexuality. So essentially, in other words, sort of the colonizers, if you will, they viewed African sexuality as immoral. Well, I suppose they viewed sexuality really in the sense of moral or immoral, rather than the indigenous perspective of the fact that it was just diverse sort of human perspectives. So what you end up finding is you have a situation where colonialism plays quite a significant role in how legislation was ultimately shaped. It plays quite a significant role in how diverse practices that were otherwise not demonized, not considered shameful, then turned into acts that were considered as perverse, if you will. Effectively, another way to think about it is that colonialism rewrote indigenous practices and placed them upon, I guess, Western standards of morality, which kind of sought to suppress this sexual diversity within African societies. So in Europe, the association of morality with civilization and justice in the latter half of the 19th century led to the British challenging the lineage based system of sexual regulation and imposing their own perceptions of sexual immorality in these sort of colonized territories. And I'm very much going to kind of talk in the context primarily of the British Empire, because a lot of the countries I've looked at have been in sort of sub-Saharan Africa. So what you end up having is that while most African sort of societies placed and continue to place a high priority on heterosexual marriage and reproduction. When we look at pre-colonial history, many cultures permitted same-sex practices, provided they took place, I guess, within the bounds of specific rituals, the sacred or secret spaces or designated social roles. Religion also was quite important, in the sense that, and I use the word religion kind of quite broadly, but unlike Western religions, which are typically characterized as having a historical founder and sacred scriptures, African indigenous religions are oriented towards sort of sustaining community, supporting spiritual anchors, by providing sort of ethical guidance and choice and insight and teaching and healing. So the narratives of missionaries and colonialists about Africans depicted them as underdeveloped and unsophisticated. So the attitudes of the European settlers towards sexuality were inherently different to those of the indigenous community. And the sort of the missionaries and the European settlers considered these acts and these behaviors and linked them to sin, if you will, whereas that wasn't necessarily the case for indigenous communities themselves. So a system of sort of sexual morality emerged, and certain sexual activities, such as what we would consider homosexuality or would term as homosexuality, were now deemed unnatural, immoral, and perverse. And even when we think about language, terms such as homosexuality and gay are not words that were, that were from the continent, if you will. These were terms that were subsequently developed with time. And other research that has been done as to same-sex acts in African context, they have different words for what would otherwise be classed as homosexuality in a Western context. So it kind of illustrates the point that there isn't sort of this singular view of what this sexual behavior is or the motivations behind it. And when I kind of talk on the next slide, we'll kind of get a clearer picture as to what I mean by motivations, if you will. So I guess the emphasis on sort of heterosexuality as the acceptable relationship status and regulation of same-sex interaction between, consenting adults, it then became embedded in African society. And then you have a situation where there was European attempts to legislate African behavior and morality. And that kind of led to state intervention into the most private and personal aspects of African lives. And you had the development of, laws, anti-sodomy laws or sodomy laws that regulate behavior. And then you had the introduction of laws that essentially framed marriage in the context of Christian marriage. And it's these laws that's kind of set the foundation and are now being used as, I guess, weapons against sexual minorities and the progression of LGBT rights, which is kind of ironic in its sense. But anyways, I feel like that is another discussion all on its own, which kind of simply don't have time for. But yeah, so let's kind of thinking about the types of acts or the types of behaviors or examples of African same-sex relations. There have been quite a few studies that have been done, but I've just kind of picked out a handful. So in terms of Mark Epprecht, in the question of whether same-sex relations existed prior to colonialism, this study, it examined the history of homosexuality in Southern Africa and essentially argues that homosexual experimentation was common among, for example, adolescent boys, and that it was a normal part of the sexual learning process. So same-sex acts amongst these adolescent boys were normally carried out in the bush while they were herding cattle, and society almost expected these experiments at the age of puberty. And even in cases that involved otherwise sort of heterosexual males, beyond the years of sort of this acceptable experimentation, these acts were not sort of automatically taken as serious breaches of morality. Um, Similarly, sort of Moody study found that marriage between males, I use the term marriage not in the context of the legal sense, but in this study they found that marriage between males were commonplace amongst African mine workers at the beginning of the 20th century. So in the late sort of 1800s to early 1900s, the diamond boom in South Africa created the conditions that sort of gave rise to a distinct form of sexual relationship. But this was within the closed compound system, which didn't permit women within it. So it was fenced off from the surrounding community. So as a result of that, men adapted to this living situation, and the practice of mature men with authority, taking younger men as temporary wives, if you will, became the norm. Um, and what Moody sort of found in the study was that these mind marriages, they sort of implied more than casual sex, and they were not regarded as shameful. These relationships were supposed to be exclusive, and they were modeled on traditional rural marriage, but without the responsibilities and the obligations of conception. But similarly with Stephen Murray and Will Roscoe, they did quite a detailed study, and they unequivocally refute claims that African societies lacked homosexual patterns and that they had no words for those who desire their own sex. In fact, they found evidence of same-sex patterns in approximately 50 societies across the East, the West, the Central, and also Southern Africa. But also, they kind of argued that there is substantial evidence that same-sex practices and patterns were traditional, they were indigenous, and that there's actually no evidence that non-Africans introduced homosexuality into Africa. In fact, it's been argued that colonialists didn't introduce homosexuality, but rather they introduced the intolerance of it. They introduced the systems of surveillance and regulations and systems for suppressing these otherwise diverse forms of expressing sexuality. What's quite different is that a lot of the studies, a lot of the research, they tend to look at sort of these sort of male to male sexual conduct. And you do have some studies with regards to marriages between females. And again, Murray and Roscoe, they looked into it. And these kind of woman to woman marriages were regarded with respect in many African societies. And they've actually been documented in more than 30 African populations. And the motivations and the purposes of these marriages, they tended to vary. So, for example, you might have a widowed woman with no children who could marry a younger woman so that they both sort of acquire legal and social status of a husband and wife. You might have a childless woman who could acquire offspring by marrying a widow with children, or women in a position of authority would otherwise obtain wives who could, undertake sort of work, I guess, as servants or do menial work. So there's kind of a lot of motivations behind woman to woman marriages. But what the studies don't tell us about woman to woman marriages is about the sexual orientation or the sexual conduct behind it. So anthropologists and Africans alike have almost been fairly unanimous in that woman to woman marriages occurred for the purpose of acquiring children or wealth, and they didn't necessarily involve sex or an emotional attachment. So woman to woman marriages to an extent can be considered as quite distinct from, say, same sex marriages, as because the parties will enter into the marriage to ensure the continuation of the kinship and the lineage, as opposed to having that sort of that sexual element to it. But then it kind of raises the question of, well, where does the Christian marriage aspect come into it? You know, one man, one woman, and so forth. Um, because in sub-Saharan Africa, marriage was primarily polygamous, but missionaries required, or rather, they encouraged monogamy and fidelity. So, in an attempt to establish, monogamous Christian marriage, there was a conflict between missionaries and customary marriages. So they struggled with sort of establishing the notions of monogamy and individualism in customary law. So to try and sort of encourage these monogamous Christian marriage, this is where colonial governments established these legal codes and implemented marriage law with very little consideration for whether it would be suitable in Africa, and really the impact that it would have on indigenous customary law. So consequently, what you now have is a situation where you have these historical, let's call them sodomy laws, that prohibit same-sex conduct, which are then modified or updated to then prohibit now advocacy for LGBT rights. You have some countries that prohibit the registration of NGOs that advocate for sexual minority rights. And then similarly, you have other countries, like I mentioned earlier, Nigeria, where they go one step further. Even Uganda now, actually, go one step further, and they also prohibit same-sex marriage. So it's now a situation on the continent where you have some countries like Botswana that are taking active steps to decriminalize, to be more inclusive, more awareness of fundamental rights and freedoms, and to continue to develop, you know, I guess, an environment that is more tolerant. Certainly a legal one. Social acceptance is very different from legal acceptance, and one doesn't always follow the other. But equally, you don't need social acceptance to some extent to have legal change. So it's on the actual continent, you have a significant progress, if you will, significant strides that have taken place in terms of LGBT rights. I mean, the most classic example is South Africa continues to be the only country on the continent where same-sex marriage is legally permitted, in addition to same-sex couples adopting and having pension rights and all those things that, for all intents and purposes, for example, you'd expect here in the UK. Whereas you can have, neighbors very close to South Africa where the situation is entirely different. But one thing that continues to be very evident, particularly when you look at the political landscape and the arguments that have been raised against the recognition of same-sex relationship, against decriminalization, is this continued narrative that same-sex relationships don't belong on the African continent, that they are un-African. You simply have to Google an African politician and homosexuality, and that's the recurring narrative, which then also ties into the narrative that's being and the rhetoric that's kind of being put forward by religious leaders. But it doesn't change history. It doesn't change the fact that these acts and these behaviors and these sort of various types of relationships, whatever the motivations behind them may have been, existed on the African continent. But it's a tricky situation because it the historical existence of these relationship forms doesn't it's difficult to then use that as a basis now for arguing for decriminalization, for example, because in some respects there's almost a bit of a disconnect because it seems like it was so long ago, pre-colonial, all these indigenous practices and what have you. So you often find now when LGBT rights groups, NGOs are seeking decriminalization, or they are, pursuing, sort of rights of some sort, is that they very much rely on international human rights norms. They argue about equality and non-discrimination as a basis for, as a basis for their legal claims, in the hopes that that will, bolster or support change. And in a lot of countries, it has worked. South Africa being one of them, Botswana more recently, a couple of years ago, being another one of them. And some countries, for example, Angola, that decriminalized without particularly the need for a lot of court action, if you will. So it's a really mixed bag on the continent when we think about the state, if you will, of sexual minority rights. I suppose in some respects it's really encouraging that some countries are moving towards, for example, decriminalization or providing more protections. But ultimately, it doesn't change the fact that other countries are very much, what's the word I'm looking for? Digging their heels in, and very much relying on this African cultures, African tradition, African norms argument against the expansion of any kind of sexual minority rights. So ultimately, I guess the criminal legal system in various African states, they attempt to regulate how, when, and with whom individuals may have consensual sex. But the studies that have been, I mean, and there's only really a handful of studies I've looked at, there's so many more, but the studies have shown and they've demonstrated how colonialism and Western missionaries, they introduced norms that were alien to pre-colonial African societies, including sort of the strict regime of heterosexuality. Whereas indigenous African societies, they were not purely heteronormative, as political and religious sort of homophobic rhetoric may lead us to believe. And ultimately, the Western hierarchy of sexuality was exported through colonialism, and it positioned heterosexuality and Christian marriage as a superior status, as superior to other indigenous um, sort of practices. And ultimately, I suppose the consequence of that is indigenous sexual practices were characterized ultimately as deviant and immoral. And this justified the civilizing mission, if you will, of Western Christianity. So from 1860 onwards, if we look in the context of the British Empire, um, the main, what it achieved was to spread a specific set of legal codes and common law throughout the colonies. And it's these laws that continue to exist today and continue to, you know, um, repress, if you will, sexual minority and prevent the development of sexual minority rights. Yeah, so I feel like that was a whistle stop tour, and yeah, I apologize if it's probably a little bit too short, but I don't know. I think it'd be quite good to have a discussion about it. Esmeri, what are your thoughts?
I think it's really interesting. It's really lovely. Thank you very much. Also, I'm very much a proponent of the skeleton as a presentation, so you can fill in the blanks in discussion because you can't really say everything. I think the audience questions will sort of make a richer conversation.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
yeah, thank you for that, Za. I have I've taken the chair's prerogative to write a few questions in the chat to kick off the Q&A. And hopefully the questions that I'm asking will prompt other questions from the audience. I'm going to go to the chat because I try to preach. That's what I preach, which is to write the questions and take the pressure off. I'm There are so many questions that I want to ask, and it's about the political expedience because we understand the role of politics
Mm-hmm.
in sort of colonial conversations. So I suppose as a starting point, who how does it benefit countries like Uganda and Nigeria to promote anti-sodomy as a
Mm-hmm.
political agenda? And to what extent does that create like who does that benefit? Um, and think of the actors as boundless, so international community, local interests, for instance, and all points in between. Who does it benefit for?
That's an interesting point because it's so complex. So politics and religion are not divorced from each other.
Okay.
And you often find a situation where political leaders have a lot of power. Religious leaders have a lot of power through the association with political leaders. So you'll have a situation, particularly in Uganda, if I think about the Anti-Homosexuality Act of 2014 that was subsequently repealed, not because of, not because of what's the word I'm looking for? It wasn't passed without the right quorum. So if that had been done, then the law would probably still be in place now, despite the legal action behind it. But that was introduced as a way to distract against a lot of the other socioeconomic problems that were happening in the country. So promises of, preventing homosexuality growing in the country and having religious leaders speaking on the same podium as political leaders, religious leaders that have hundreds and thousands of followers. Hundreds of thousands of followers equals hundreds and thousands of votes. So in some respects, that's kind of one of the motivations behind it. But as well, particularly if I kind of think in the context of Uganda and to an extent Nigeria, is that some of these religious organizations, they have connections with, say, American evangelical extreme
Okay.
churches
Okay.
that promise a lot of money. And so Scott Lively is an example of one of these preachers, if I remember his name correctly. And they will come to the country and they'll preach against homosexuality and equally bring funds along with them. So there is something to be gained for the religious leaders, for the political leaders. And some of these churches, you have political leaders attending these churches. So they're kind of in each other's pockets, if you will. Um, so it's a mutually beneficial arrangement for political leaders and equally for the religious elite, if you will. And that's part of the problem, is that you then have sexual minorities fighting against these very, very powerful institutions. Um, and it also kind of trickles down, if you will, into the court system because some of the appointed judges won't want to make decisions that go against the majoritarian view. So you tend to find that some courts will simply just take the view that, the country is not ready for this. So this was the case in Kenya, where the application to decriminalize same-sex acts was rejected by the court for many reasons. It was a very, very, very long judgment that took me about a week to read. But one of the justifications was that, well, the people of Kenya don't want it, so why would the court system decriminalize same-sex acts or rule that same-sex acts should be decriminalized and encourage the legislature to do the same? So it's actually really, really, really complex about how politics and religion kind of have that interplay, but how it also sometimes affects the ruling and the decisions made by the court system.
Thank you for that. I have follow-ups, but I also have a number of questions in the chat from the audience, so I'll go to that first. John has
Hmm.
a question. John, did you want to read your question? Are you positioned to do so?
Yeah, I can try and do so.
Hello.
Um, yeah, just brilliant paper, really interesting.
Thank you.
And I was kind of thinking of some of the work which African, particularly Nigerian scholars have done around gender uh, and reconceiving it as something that was imposed through the European concept and was not an indigenous concept. So I was just wondering if I could find my question because others have moved on. To what extent can we understand the anti-LGBT plus perspectives you described here as reflecting the wider imposed colonial perceptions of gender and see it as a continuity into sort of post neo-colonial African states?
Um, so I hope I understand the question correctly, but I think part of the issue rather, or part of, and certainly when we think about sort of the development of laws, is that a lot of the justification for why laws need to be a certain way or why continued criminalization needs to take place goes back to sort of this patriarchal perspective of that family values, if you will, or African family values, and the legitimacy of African family values depends on having a man, having a woman as part of a household. And that is what makes an African family. And in the absence of that, then that's, I guess, an African and not the norm at all. Um, so it does create very much an uphill battle, if you will, with regards to how you try to alter this very deeply rooted, deeply embedded perspective on, family values and, effectively what relationships should look like. Um, Sorry, what was the question again? I feel like I've gone off on a tangent.
No,
Uh,
it's cool. It's cool. It's cool. Thanks. Thanks.
okay. So are you satisfied with the response, John?
Yeah, yes, it's cool.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, both Zanele and John. John, sorry, Patrick, we have a question from you. Are you positioned to read the question, or do you want me to read it on your behalf? Hi. Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Um Hi, Zanel. I would like to congratulate you on your brilliant presentation
Thank
and
you.
your research. I learned a lot from it. I don't exactly have a question, but a comment. Yeah. In Brazil, I am Brazilian. In Brazil, homophobia is a very significant and pervasive issue in our society. Much of this is due to religious reasons, notably evangelical churches. Uh, However, African-based religions such as Candomblé and Umbanda are radically welcoming and free from any prejudice regarding sexuality. Therefore, the greatest manifestation of tolerance towards sexuality in Brazil is of African origin. Is this my comment? And congratulations.
Thank you very much. Just kind of, I suppose, pick up on that. A couple of the interesting, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a couple of interesting principles or concepts, and one of these derives from sort of an Asian African word, Ubuntu, and it kind of means humanity to others. And Ubuntu was a phrase that continually was used in the South African context. Now, South Africa has a very unique history with regards to same-sex orientation and decriminalization. That's kind of rooted all the way back to the apartheid struggle and the inclusion of sexual orientation in the constitution. So very, very unique set of circumstances that sort of laid the foundations for the recognition of same-sex marriage in South Africa. But Botswana, interestingly enough, has a similar concept to Ubuntu, and it's called Boto, which is spelled Botho, and it has a similar sort of notions of humanity to others. I am because we are sort of a thing. We are one, in other words. And I've noticed as well that with the development of, or rather with the sort of the change in the environment and the potential slight tolerance and, decriminalization and equality in employment law and some of the rhetoric that comes from some political leaders, this again is a concept that seems to come out. And I've not come across other connotations of Ubuntu or Boto in some of these other countries. So, as a side note, it kind of makes me think as to whether these kind of principles, if you will, are quite important in the context of helping to shape society and helping to encourage tolerance, if these principles are sort of fundamental to, I guess, indigenous societies, if that kind of makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both. We have a question from Kara Malloy. Kara, are you positioned to read your question?
Yes, I am, Esri. Thanks a million. My apologies, my camera hasn't been working today, but hopefully the mic is working and I'm coming through. Zanele, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. It's such an interesting area. I had a few questions that I kind of threw down the chat. So the first one I was really interested in is just what kind of primary sources or data is actually there in exploring such a complex topic and something that unfortunately in jurisdictions like Uganda, because of the legal framework there, those behaviors have to remain hidden. So just some of the challenges, I suppose, in actually conducting research on this area. You also mentioned Botswana and some of the really positive steps that have been taken there to develop this more inclusive environment. And I was just wondering, do you have any thoughts yourself on what factors have actually helped this to come about? And I suppose, could they be reproduced in any other countries? Or is there something maybe unique going on in Botswana at the time that's facilitating that more tolerant approach?
Yeah, I'll deal with the Botswana one first, and then I can talk about Uganda. But in Botswana, there's a couple of things that have happened. So back in the 90s, there was an application that was made to decriminalize homosexuality, and that application was unsuccessful. It wasn't necessarily planned. It was sort of jumping on the back of a criminal law case that was to do with same-sex acts in a prison. So there wasn't really much strategic litigation behind it. There wasn't an analysis. What's the word I'm looking for? There wasn't a sort of an analysis of the environment to see whether it was conducive to this application. But because the judgment set out the deficiencies and the reasons why it was unsuccessful, it then created a foundation or a platform for strategic litigation. So it then meant that LGBT rights groups could very much plan on how they would then tackle an application in future. So LGBT rights groups, they very much focused on a wide range of things. So they had a multi-pronged approach. And this approach involved speaking to community leaders, speaking to religious leaders, really kind of grassroots approach to advocacy to raise awareness, not as to international human rights, fundamental rights, but more the focus on essentially whether you are straight, gay, black, blue, green, you are still human, and that it was better for the community to treat people equally rather than to treat people differently. So ultimately, as time went on, these groups started to develop, I guess, the equivalent of a following and support from community members. So when they then started instigating court proceedings, such as firstly the registration of these LGBT rights groups, there was a strength in numbers approach. And there was community support. And then there was incremental steps that were being taken. So the registration of groups, some of the sort of court cases that were ultimately leading up to an application for decriminalization. But if we compare with other countries, take, for example, Nigeria, they don't have the long history of LGBT rights groups. They don't have the long history of strategic litigation, of grassroots action, of community activities and support and everything like that. So if there are any attempts, which there haven't been many in Nigeria at all, to push against, these laws, then of course they're met with resistance, and there isn't the support for them. So that's kind of the main difference when we start to compare and break down these individual countries and see what happens on the ground. So take, for example, when the Same-Sex Marriage Act of 2013 was passed in Nigeria, there were groups that opposed it. So when they went to the public forums, the hate and the resistance was so bad that they ended up having to leave these public forums. And even if there were politicians that were supportive of these groups, they didn't have the confidence or the security, if you will, to publicly express these groups, simply because, again, there was so much resistance. So this is where you kind of start to see those little differences between, or quite significant differences rather, between countries like Botswana and, say, Nigeria. So it doesn't. In other words, in Botswana, it didn't happen overnight. Technically, the journey to decriminalization started in 1993. It's only now the efforts of these rights groups is becoming more and more apparent, and the judiciary is more willing to consider these claims. Does that answer the question about Botswana?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's so fascinating. Thank you, Zanele, for that overview.
Okay, I'm sorry, I forgot the question about Uganda.
No worries at all. It was more so just about what type of primary sources or data are available there for researchers trying to investigate this fascinating but really complex kind of topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's where the tricky part is that you have researchers on the ground for a start. You have sort of rights groups that are working undercover, that are working privately to conduct this research. But the fact of the matter is the data in itself is probably not as extensive as it could be. Because it's so dangerous, for researchers. It's dangerous for, sexual minorities in the country. So when I've kind of been doing my research, it's been looking at reports. There's one big organization whose name kind of comes out of my mind. I can't remember it right now. And they do a lot of research on the African continent, and they are researchers based in South Africa and various countries that have all come together. And they do surveys. Oh, Afrobarometer, that's the name of it, Afrobarometer. And they do surveys. But these surveys, again, you have to kind of, as much as they are reliable, you take them with a pinch of salt because the data set will be relatively quite small. There's other organizations, again, called ILGA World, and they produce a report sort of every couple of years, I would say. What's it called, the report? State-sponsored homophobia report, and that provides really, really good insights again as to the state of sort of LGBT rights in various countries, not just in Africa but across the world. So in simple terms, in other words, rather, it's dangerous work in some of these countries, whereas in other countries it's not so bad.
That's great. Thank you so much, Zanele. That's really interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that Karen Zanele. We have one question from Omar. Omar, are you positioned to ask the question yourself? To read the question out?
Yes, but I have a teething baby at witching hour, so I might get interrupted.
It's okay.
That's okay if you don't mind. We don't.
Only way I get to listen to your talk if we play games too. Thank you so much for the talk. I did manage to listen to it, even through baby. And so it's kind of linked to your last discussion points, actually. I was wondering if you could kind of speak to the tension of decolonizing the ideas around sexuality and gender, that the tension that a lot of the advocacy is still kind of modern and Western and still quite restrictive in some ways. And yeah, just in your experience, how people are trying to work to that tension. Of course, there's also this problematic sort of trying to go back to an imagined past, even though that's obviously is factual, but just bring back exactly the way where it's a different world now. And so there's a real tension in that across all kinds of decolonizing. So I wondered in this particular space, how you feel about it.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of things. So one of the sort of persistent approaches or kind of I don't know what I'm looking for. Yeah, one of the consistent approaches that advocates or sexual minority groups have taken, especially when they approach the courts, if you will, is to argue for fundamental rights based on sort of these international human rights norms. And in some contexts that works, but then in a lot of contexts it simply doesn't, because then you have this counter argument of cultural relativism, which is that these universal norms should only apply in the context in which, taken into consideration, if you will, the context of the particular country in which you're seeking to apply them. So you can argue that, the European Court of Human Rights or, the European Court of Human Rights has declared that sexual orientation discrimination shouldn't be permitted. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a standard that's going to be applied in an African context if the majoritarian view is that same-sex relationships are inimical to African norms. So that's kind of the difficulty with, if you will, relying on Western perspectives, if you will, against what is again seen as a Western issue trying to be imposed in an African context. So some of the sort of thoughts that have been put forward is that perhaps what might benefit, these claims for equality is to try and link the claims to things such as communitarianism. So kind of this social or political idea that emphasizes the connection between individuals and their communities, and that actually there is more to be gained from looking after the community that includes this diverse range of individuals rather than casting them aside. And that in itself provides less focus on individualistic rights, if you will, that international human rights norms tend to sort of lean towards. So that's kind of one perspective of it. But again, that can be very, very difficult in a context where sexual minorities are not just faced with criminalization, but as a consequence of criminalization, they can't access healthcare and they can't access, homes, and they can't, do what would be essentially, I suppose, access to rights that the average citizen would have. So the instinct is, of course, to make claims against court, arguing against these fundamental rights. And then you find a situation where you're going around in circles and essentially testing the waters. But the danger of testing the waters is that it can set a precedent in the court system of rejecting claims. So that's why essentially a situational analysis, if you will, in a country is really, really important as a starting point. A situational analysis of social acceptance or the extent of it, situational analysis of the political landscape, of, you know, the court, the judicial landscape, and then determine if at that point there is an appetite, even the smallest glimmer of hope of favorable claims, because it doesn't have to be decriminalization from zero. It could be little steps that ultimately show a pattern of recognition of same-sex of LGBT rights that may ultimately lead to decriminalization. So yeah, I don't know, I hope that helps. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm struck by the thread that holds these questions together. So from John's question about the sort of approach, the reflecting on the wider, sort of how we consider like the wider imposed colonial perception of gender that have persisted in the post/neo-colonial African states. To Kara's question about how to overcome the potential pitfalls of investigating this very timely and important topic, but also in a context where asking such questions could lead to a tremendous amount of vulnerability to your research participants. To something you said earlier about the idea that we are dealing with a diverse, not just distinct states, but within those states, very diverse cultures on the ground. So working from the grassroots up, you're not simply dealing with like a sort of homogenous set of beliefs within one the political entity.
Yeah.
To Omar's questions about the tensions. The tension of reconciling, trying to move towards greater expanded rights for individuals, but with tools crafted within the very place where colonialism came from. So now we're living in this sort of like, and I'll use my example. I think using my example is will clarify a little bit more. I was born in Jamaica, and Jamaica, as we know, is a colony of Britain. And the issue here is that there's a tremendous amount of homophobia. There's also a tremendous amount of evangelicalism. And so the result of this is that that homophobia is fueled by these moral panics about the implications of homosexuality. So there's a lot of talk always about Sodom and Gomorrah. I don't know if there's a lot of biblical conversations, and people are very well versed at it because the society is very steeped in these forms of socialization that people who don't go to church will send their children to church because they see the benefits of religion, of religious education. So even though they're not themselves practitioners, they subscribe to these beliefs, right? So here we have, and so the sort of interesting thing where we have now countries like Britain, who are the colonizers, who have now moved past, to a large extent, in terms of their legal codes and the ideas that they promote around freedom and rights for individuals. They have moved past these colonial practices officially, and certainly they support it. There are accountability mechanisms. Yet we know that it is from this place that both sets of tensions emerge. On the one hand, places like Britain, America, Canada, and other well-off countries that have a lot of money to give back sponsor this sort of polarization, right? So on the one hand, we have evangelical churches sponsoring organizations in Jamaica and making it beneficial to remain homophobic and making life very vulnerable for individuals, whether or not your family members practicing as a member of the LGBT community or not, a supporter of, or on the other hand, those people who are radically anti-gay and have a lot of respect and positioning within the community. So they're not marginal individuals. They have important voices. They're well respected. They're well heard, sometimes every day on the radio. So it's interesting that each of these questions seem to tap into that idea. And I think Omar's questions in the end really glues it together, the idea that there's a tension and there's a whole bunch of paradoxes popping up So we have the colonized becoming the intolerable, and the colonizer being the tolerant. Sorry, the intolerant versus the tolerant.
Yeah. And I think one other thing I probably forgot to mention is that when it comes to change, sometimes it's just time that's needed. And leading on to Kira's point, one thing I forgot to sort of state is that with Botswana, the support for sexual minorities has come from the top down. Previous presidents were anti-LGBT rights, but when Botswana then had the HIV epidemic, the president at the time was very much using language like we all have to stick together, we all have to protect each other and things like that, and included sexual minorities within this because the population was suffering. Not only were a lot of people dying, but this was infecting employment and what have you. And that's why you ended up having discrimination, sexual orientation discrimination in employment law outlawed, and this was to protect sexual minorities. But now the new president, Duma Boko, as of last year, he's a human rights lawyer. And he's also a firm supporter of LGBT rights. So it kind of shows how, when we compare with other countries, that political support can have quite a significant impact on the extent to which, I suppose LGBT rights are advanced in the country as well. Thank you very much, John. But yeah, no, that's pretty much it, really.
That's sorry, I'm not muted. Just to follow up on one final point, I want to put you guys, but a term that comes to mind is the idea of moral penance. And you mentioned the HIV epidemic. So to what extent, which was typically associated, when we heard about it from this end of the news cycle, it was Africa. So there was no real distinction about where these things had taken root and the communal responses. What role does moral panic play against the backdrop of these shaming and naming, shaming, and labeling traditions of that contribute to both exclusion and inclusion? What role did moral panic play?
I think moral panic plays a real significant part because when you think about moral panic, you have this situation where it's creating them and us. So, these are the people who are affecting the traditional values, who are affecting African values, who are ultimately going to lead to the demise of society. And if enough people jump on the bandwagon, and these people being starting from your religious elite, your political leaders, then quite naturally, whether rightly or wrongly, well, mostly wrongly, you then find society starts to follow. And what starts as a small fire turns into this massive thing. And then it then means that in the midst of all that moral panic, at what stage or to what extent can these groups then try to take steps to make society realize actually we're not the bad guys here. And I think that's kind of a thing that is that's very evident in a lot of these countries, is this idea that same-sex relationships are just going to lead to the ultimate demise of the traditional 2.0 family, but there is no basis for that.
The basis is the scripture.
Is the scripture, yes, of course.
When you go to church and there's the sort of fire and brimstone ceremonies around about being burnt alive by God because of his wrath, then if you are a person who relies on these ways of thinking because we talk about the importance of role models. It's not just for children, it's for the entire community, for society, to people to look up to give you hope, especially in times of insecurity, inequality, etc. This idea that being homosexual, being part of the LGBT community makes you the problem, is greatly emphasized.
Yeah.
Okay. So John has sent a message. Thanks for the papers, Zanele. A lot to think about. He's had to run. I don't know if anyone has any further questions. Do you guys do the remaining attendees, do you have any further questions that you want to pose for Zanele? No, okay. I will take the opportunity to say thank you again. And just to say that, you know, there's a potential to follow up. Let's see, Caroline has left a message. She said, I'm sorry I arrived late, but thanks very much for the fantastic discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Thanks for taking the time. As always, I'll extend a thank you to both the presenter, Zanele, thank you so much. Let me try to do the applause. Oh, it's gonna do it again. It's not gonna let me do it, of course. Okay, I won't try. Sorry, my apologies. Zoom has changed since I last used it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to Kara has managed to find the function button. Thank you very much to both sets people for attending. It's greatly appreciated as always. Watch the space. One of these days, the website will be up and running. It is under construction at the moment. And the recording from this session will be made available. But as always, if you want to get in touch with Zah to have a further conversation about her fantastic research, please contact me, and I'll share her information with you as will and accordingly. So I'll take the chance to say thank you for coming, and I will see you guys. Our next presentation is Julian Go out of Chicago on the 19th of February. And following this is Emily Rose Hayes. Hayes Rose. Forgive me, Emily. Right. Thank you guys. And I'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Oh, wait, let me stop the recording. I always forget to do this.